Thank you, Scott. And hi, everybody. I'm David, as Scott just said. The way we normally do this, if you haven't attended before, is that I talk about a topic for 10 minutes or so, and then we turn it over to questions through the Q&A feature. Your questions can be related to the topic I just talked about or anything you want related to addiction. This is really a wide open forum. That's what kind of makes it fun for us, I think, and informative for you. So tonight, I wanted to talk briefly about fantasy. And I think this is something that is an integral part of addictive behavior and something that a lot of people struggle with. And I think it's so important to understand how fantasy plays a role in our addiction and what we can do kind of to be aware of it and alert to it. And also how we can kind of incorporate maybe healthy daydreaming, if you will, later on. But I want to make a distinction about those two things. But first of all, let me just say, sexual fantasies in general, but sexual fantasies particularly are prominent among sex addicts and porn addicts and chemsex users or people who combine drugs and sex. And they, just like any other behavior in sex addiction, they're really used for the most part to soothe pain, to self-soothe, if you will, to numb, to take care of discomfort or boredom, to numb the pain I mentioned, even to generate feelings of excitement. It's our kind of go-to place to escape to and kind of rev up. And it's often part of an addictive ritual beforehand, leading up to behaviors. And it's one of the things that can cause a relapse if somebody's not, if they're acting out or at danger of acting out. Oftentimes the first step toward that is fantasy. And oftentimes people will kind of engage in fantasy with no intention of getting in trouble. And at some point it will kind of overwhelm their capacity to resist and can often lead to a relapse. So, as I say, it's this really common phenomenon in addiction, used to self-soothe and so on. I do want to draw a distinction between like daydreaming and fantasy, and they're both the same. They both are kind of dissociative, but I think it's important. I do a lot of meditation, and I think in a way, when I'm in my zone, meditating, it's kind of a brain place that's similar to fantasy. And I think the difference, and I'm often asked how to differentiate this by clients, the difference to me is intention. When I'm in that space of kind of consciously turning off my active brain and kind of letting the creative juices flow, it's all about the intention of kind of connecting with myself, connecting with my feelings, connecting with insight, connecting with something outside of myself, and really kind of enjoying that connection. And that's all about kind of letting go of my conscious mind and, in a way, daydreaming, I guess, just letting my mind wander as I meditate. But in that sense, it's all about connection. The dangerous kind of fantasy I think we talked about, going back to intention, is to really disconnect. And I think that's where we get in trouble. And it's that disconnecting piece, disconnecting from our pain, from boredom, from uncomfortable thoughts or feelings or situations, avoiding. That's the kind of fantasy that can really get addicts in trouble. So that intention piece is really, really important, where it's not coming from a place of inner connection and joy, but rather to numb feelings that echo our old childhood experiences of rejection or abandonment or physical or sexual abuse or other kinds of uncomfortable situations. So I think that's a really important distinction to be aware of. The root causes, I just kind of hinted at it, obviously. The root causes of this are really childhood abuse of some kind, or neglect or trauma, whatever that looks like. And we've talked here before about the many faces of trauma. I think obviously the ones that are obvious for people are, sexual abuse or physical abuse or emotional abuse. But there's other kinds of situations that can cause PTSD and trauma reactions later down the road. And that can be any kind of irregularity in the family, the death of a parent, a sibling who has a chronic illness, anything that makes the family kind of irregular. And one that I really want to emphasize here, neglect. We've talked a lot about neglect, but neglect not being, we've talked here, Scott mentioned a case, and I relate to it as well, where, I had a roof over my head, I had, a car when I was in high school, I had meals and food, and we never went for one, but there was a lot of neglect in the house, and that my parents were emotionally disconnected. They just didn't take an interest in me or my work or my life. and combine that with other kinds of trauma, and I was kind of set up. And I mentioned a couple of clients that I early on learned how to dissociate, and I was very conscious of it. And some of it was with healthy ways, with music or with reading. But other ways, kind of just daydreaming and just kind of, I got really to be an expert on disconnecting. And when I encountered alcohol as a teenager, like everybody does, I was ready-made to be an addict, because this was a substance that could easily just fuel my ability to fantasy and daydream right out of my life and disconnect. And that was the story of my addictive behavior. Later on, I discovered other things that could do that besides drugs, different behaviors. So it's all rooted in these old patterns. And an essential task of recovery is to be able to learn how to stay present with our feelings and our fears of abandonment and our discomfort and even our boredom. And boredom is a big trigger. We've talked about that here too. But these are stimulant intensity addictions, right? Sex addiction and porn and chemsex, and boredom can be a relapse risk. So, but to learn how to sit with those and be present, even if it's uncomfortable. And that's a really critical piece, without disconnecting and floating away in fantasy. So that's kind of what we see. I want to mention one other aspect of this, and that not maybe as common as it might be in our population, but that's romance addiction, and romance and love addiction, and this thing called limerence. Really, romance addiction is a lot about the same fantasy behavior, and it's often when we meet someone and we kind of impose on them all our expectations and thoughts and ideas before we really even know them, right? We make this romantic notion of who they are, and we kind of fill in the gaps of all the unknowns. And at those points in a relationship, we really typically, all the red flags, go right by us. We don't see them because we're not seeing the real person. We're seeing this fantasy of who they are. And when we're in that early stage of relationship, whether you're a romance addict or not, we experience a biochemical connection called limerence, which has to do with oxytocin, the so-called love or bonding hormone, and many other chemicals that create this. The purpose of it is for us to bond with people. And when mothers give birth, they have an oxytocin rush that bonds them with their baby. So does the baby. And by the way, so does the husband. And so it's all kind of family bonding. But that limerence is a mood-changing event. When we are in limerence, and everybody who's been in a relationship can remember how it was to be kind of infatuated and sending messages, and you can't get enough of the person. You're wondering what they're doing, what they're having for lunch, and all that stuff. And so that's a kind of a mood-altering event. And for a romance addict, when that limerence fades, and it does normally as a relationship progresses, they lose the intensity, and often will go to the next one. And they're addicted to really that falling in love part of a relationship. So these are all ways that fantasy kind of plays out. But I think it's just an essential piece to really understand it, get it in hand, and really identify. Because for an addict, for a well-polished addict, dropping into fantasy is such an automatic process. I'm disconnected and dissociated before I even know it. Or I was at one time. I think with a lot of recovery and therapy, I can now kind of learn when it's happening and pull myself back. But I think for most addicts early on, they're disconnected and they may not even know it hit them. And so it's a really important thing to have awareness about and to really practice your skills. And so that's my 2 cents or 3 cents on fantasy.
Thank you, David. This is interesting because on Saturday mornings, I teach a work group for men, sex, and porn addicts who are new to recovery, and we're sort of teaching them about addiction. And we spent probably half to 2/3 of our session this week. We were talking about the cycle of addiction, but we spent almost the entire time talking about the fantasy stage of the addiction. There's triggers, there's ritualization and fantasy, then there's acting out, and then there's kind of distancing and then despair, which pushes us back into our triggers. But it's the ritualization and fantasy portion of the cycle of sex addiction and porn addiction and romance addiction that is the high. Acting out is not the high. For us, using is the fantasy. That's where we escape from our reality. And sex and porn addicts, we have a name for it. We call it the bubble, or we call it the trance, or we're just on another planet, and it's when the thinking part of our brain disconnects from the lizard part of the brain, and we never fantasized about consequences or potential consequences, or that bad thing that happened last time, or getting caught, or that the sex is usually terrible, or we know that's not part of the fantasy. We go into this weird, crazy thing. And by the way, this workshop, it's a 6-week work group. It's inexpensive. And we have another one starting up July the 1st. It's going to be on Wednesday nights, taught by Jason Swilling, who is our program manager for the Seeking Integrity Treatment Center. So if somebody's looking for an option and can't afford inpatient treatment, that's very inexpensive, and you can sign up for that. You got about a week left to sign up. Anyway, that's my pitch.
I'll add to that about the fantasy stage there, of the preoccupation and so on. It's really, sex, all these addictions that we treat as Seeking Integrity all deal with dopamine, which is, it's this neurotransmitter that is all about desire and anticipation. That's the high. We're getting all the dopamine rush from going on Grindr and seeing who might out there that we could hook up with, or looking at porn, or fantasizing about what if and what it might be, and the hunt, some people call it. And that's really the high, and much more than the end result. So yeah, I totally agree. And that's what's happening in the brain as well. Scott?
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Does everything that's available in the digital universe right now, does that facilitate the fantasy stage of sex and porn and relationship addictions?
I do worry about this, because yes, totally. And we talk about like the sex and dating apps that are so prevalent and so dangerous, I think, for a recovering sex addict, because that's, as we've mentioned here, that starts this whole, it's an integral part of the whole thing. But if we think about Facebook or Instagram or anything, that we have sort of the brightest minds in the United States or in the world thinking how they can make this more appealing and get our brains engaged. They know exactly how the brain works and what they need, and that we are obsessed with getting likes and seeing the next thing, and they want us to keep us engaged. Same thing with different kinds of slot machines and stuff, and gambling in Vegas. They know exactly what they're doing, and it's that intermittent reward. You don't get a reward every time, you get it sometimes, and that just, it keeps us going, keeps us engaged. Now they're looking, Facebook and Instagram want to make money from advertising revenues by keeping us going through our feed, but it's the same thing, totally. And so our brains are kind of always engaged in this.
But it's also, it's very easy for someone to, see a photo, which may or may not be a real photo, and, a couple lines of text, and to put, to take that and run with it, and suddenly that person is perfect and everything we've ever wanted, and we really don't know anything about them, but because we get so little actual information, we can just spin into fantasy so easily.
Right.
And just run with that. So,
totally.
I mean, it's harder now because you get webcams, you can actually see the person and talk to them. But people still get catfished. I mean, there's a reason there's a TV show, about catfishing, because it happens.
Right.
Right. So, all right. Questions here. I am a gay man with sex and meth addictions. I have made many unsuccessful attempts to reach 90 days of sexual abstinence. Typically, I would masturbate at some point before 90 days. Then I would find more intense porn to accompany masturbation. And that once that's not enough, I would start having sober sex and make it as intense as possible. I would fight using meth up to a point before returning to meth sooner or later. I'm making a new attempt on sexual abstinence. Is it realistic that my pattern of sexual escalation would change if I was able to reach 90 days of abstinence? Would masturbation be safe suddenly after 90 days? There's a lot packed into that, but
yeah. So we do recommend, this period of abstinence from sexual behavior, masturbation, and so on, just to let the brain kind of start to readjust to levels of stimulation and intensity that are different from those under meth and sex and porn and that kind of very high stimulation situation. There's nothing magical about 90 days. That's more of a based on kind of experience and wisdom of what happens on average. Some people can start masturbating or behaving in other ways sooner than 90 days. Some people choose 6 months. It's really highly variable. I would say, and that's one piece, but it's not the only piece. And I guess that would be my comment for your question here, is that the refraining from that is going to be a really helpful tool. At 91 days, you're not going to be magically feeling different, or at 89 days, and it may be longer or shorter, as I said. But so there's some other things that you talked about in there that you might want to also start to think about. One is porn and fantasy. Fantasy, our topic tonight. But when you start to think about stuff, are you thinking about porn or fantasies that are related to your meth use? Typically, I've had a lot of meth using clients who will not be using the drug, but try to recreate meth sex without the meth, if you will. And in a way, it sounds kind of like you're doing that, looking for the intensity, looking for the excitement, looking for a way to recapture that meth sex intensity without getting in trouble using drugs. And that's going to be a really hard thing to do. And I think it's going to be problematic, because I think a lot of people really end up getting in trouble for kind of the reasons we've talked about tonight. With this ritual and with the fantasy, these are all planting seeds. If I am trying to stay sober from meth, but I think about meth when I have an orgasm, that's keeping that little thing alive, right? We want to let that fire extinguish, and it's smoldering right now when you do that. And eventually it's going to burst into an open flame again. So I think really be careful about looking at porn, really be careful about seeking sober sex, and sober sex is fine, but I think the timing is really important. But you say sober sex and make it as intense as possible. And I think, see, again, you're seeking out the intensity. And ultimately, in my opinion, sober sex is not, it's very intense, but it's not about this kind of intensity that we see with meth and porn. It's more about the intensity of emotions and connection and really being present with someone, whatever that means for you. So I think you may be trying to kind of find workarounds to stay clean and sober and still have the old kind of meth sex. So, the bad news, and I think it's really important to be honest with people, the kind of sex people have on methamphetamine is unsustainable. That's not the kind of sex that you're going to be able to have in sobriety. And I think
it's unsustainable even if you keep using meth, isn't it?
That's true. Yeah, exactly. And I think when clients really look at it honestly, they'll say, well, the kind of sex they were having, if they're having sex at all, because oftentimes in a meth career, you're at home masturbating, looking at porn, and actually hooking up with somebody is too much trouble. So it's not often. I think it's important to look at the whole thing, not just kind of the euphoric recall aspects or the fantasy of how it was, but again, the reality of it. And really, I think it's important for clients to do a grief process around that, to let it go, because that's something that really we have to acknowledge wasn't working, and it's not going to work. And that to bring ourselves back down to earth and connect with someone sexually or with sex and intimacy in a way that is more realistic. And once our brains come down to normal levels and readjust, that is going to be highly pleasurable again and quite intense. And for most addicts who have probably not had sex without the benefit of a mood altering chemical, it's pretty intense to have sober sex for real. But I would suggest just kind of taking it easy and not try to substitute the kind of meth, all the stuff that goes with it, meth sex, and stick away from the meth itself. It's not going to work. Yeah. Remember, by the way, an orgasm is the most dopamine we can get of any natural activity. So you'll get plenty of dopamine once our brains recalibrate.
And I would just add to that once these addictions start to really link up and pair and fuse, whatever language you want to use there, it's double trouble in terms of relapse. And you just described that. I just look at porn and suddenly, not very long after, I'm using meth too. And if you started using meth, it would be not very long after before you were sexually acting out. They can become tied. And David, can you talk a little bit about the need for when they do pair or fuse, to treat them together and holistically rather than
Right. So I think one of the great mistakes of addiction treatment, as we've recognized it, is, and it has to do with training. We have people who are in facilities that are well-versed in drug addiction of all kinds, and we have a whole specialty group of therapists and facilities that treat sex addiction, but very few places treat both. In fact, Seeking Integrity is probably the only place with qualified staff to treat both. And what we know from that is that there's a lot of crossover. Something like 40% of sex addicts also have a drug addiction. There's a lot of overlap between behavioral addictions and chemical addictions. And so I can't tell you how many drug clients I've had come to me and say they were told in treatment, in their drug addiction treatment, if you just get clean and sober, the sex will take care of itself. It'll just stay clean and sober, it'll all work out. And of course it doesn't. They become full-blown sex addicts, or they never are able to have sober sex, or they never develop intimacy skills if they choose to want that. So I think we have found, and I believe with all my heart, it's important to treat these things at the same time. You can't do a sequence of, I'll get my cocaine addiction in shape and then I'll worry about my sex addiction. They're all fused to the point where it's all one big addiction. And if we don't treat them as one unit, we're really doing a disservice to the client.
Thank you. I'm going to generalize this next question. It's asked specifically about gay men and chemsex addiction, but I'm going to say, are there safe websites or apps for recovering sex addict, porn addict, drug addict, chemsex addict, any kind of addict? Are there websites or apps where we can safely find people to date?
If you were my
client, that's a really tough one, I know.
If you were my client, I'd really strongly recommend not looking for apps or websites to find that kind of connection, just because there's so many pitfalls there for actually stumbling onto drugs or other kinds of bad behaviors or addictive kinds of behaviors that you want to kind of stay away from. And also there's just the whole principle, I think, of using, because again, the rituals and the way things are connected in our brains, using an app or website to hook up or find a date. What I really recommend for people is do it kind of the old-fashioned way, I guess, or more organically, but go out. If you see somebody you have an interest in your life, we at Seek Integrity recommend a dating plan where people start with a coffee date or 2 or 3 coffee dates and then kind of move up from there to get, increasing levels of connection. I have found my clients do best if they go out and create a really robust social network. And that would be, and I live in a very gay town and do a lot of work with gay clients. I'm a gay man, and there's a ton of gay activities here. I know that's not true everywhere, but it's true in a lot of places. There's gay softball and gay churches and gay political debates and gay social clubs and gay book clubs. And, there's all kinds of stuff. If there's one website, maybe, I know Meetup has a lot of social events. They have some other things too, but they do have some social events. So I'd really encourage you to go out and in the real world and start making connections in that way. And we know, and we've, belabored this to the point of being ridiculous, but the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And it's so true. It's absolutely true that making those connections, those social connections, are going to be the key. And I found really that people have most success finding dating partners or more in that kind of setting. Scott, do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, absolutely. hookup apps and dating sites, they're no different than video games or Facebook. They have algorithms that are designed to give us a fairly regular jolt of adrenaline to keep us playing, essentially. And they're highly addictive. Hookup apps in particular are crack cocaine for sex addicts. They are crack. They're meth for a sex addict. You know, it's like boom, it's mainlining. It's just a bad idea. Join a club. You know, go to sober parties, sober dances. You know, find some activity and meet people that way. And you're also going to meet people who you have something in common with. If you join a club or an activity that you enjoy. And you're going to have more fun dating that person than you're going to have, you know, with chemsex, which you've probably discovered by now, stops being fun fairly quickly. So yeah, it's time to go the old-fashioned route, at least for a year or two. Maybe in a year or two of solid sobriety, think about a dating app or something, but even then, be really careful.
Yeah.
Have you seen any addicts who successfully replaced meth with marijuana for sex? I'm loving these questions.
These are great, thank you. And these are real questions.
These are real questions, yes.
These are what's on people's mind, and I totally honor that. I mean, these are the things people struggle with, and the short answer is no. I'll tell you why. I think addiction is this underlying set of emotional issues, right? And needs and unmet emotional needs and trauma and histories of fantasy to escape uncomfortable feelings. And once we have an issue, once we train our brains how to have sex or do anything really with drugs, that behavior is kind of semi-permanently grooved in our brains to that state. And so obviously with sex, you know, we don't want to give up sex. We want to incorporate sex back into our lives. It's a healthy thing. So we have to work at how do we re-engage with sexual behavior and leave the drugs behind. And so I think it's a big mistake. I've had clients had this exact question many times, not so much with marijuana, but with alcohol. Because I've had a lot of clients who were amphetamine addicts, you know, meth and other things, who would basically say, alcohol, you know, why can't I have a beer with my friends? Because I've never had a problem with alcohol. I don't even like the feeling of being drunk. I like that kind of high, tweaky feeling. Why can't I do that? It disinhibits me, makes me more comfortable. And the reason is that it disinhibits everything, you know, and marijuana will disinhibit and make you comfortable. And for some civilians, I guess that works. But I think for an addict, it's really dangerous because it's just a slippery slope. It gets us in the mood, and then it disinhibits our desire to stay away from drugs as well. And I think there's a bigger issue here in that what's going on there, where's the exact wording? Marijuana is a lot better, okay? But I would suggest that you could work on how to be more comfortable without any mood altering substance. And I found a lot of my clients, and I don't know you or who this is, but a lot of my clients have some anxiety about getting together with someone, whether it's just sex or even more so if it's like a little bit of intimacy or emotional connection. It's very threatening and uncomfortable, and they kind of go to a mood altering chemical to make it more comfortable. And I think that's a bad trajectory for an addict, because I think it just leads us down the garden path into other problems. And it also, by the way, I think for an addict at least, having those drugs, it's like a third person in the relationship here. It's another entity there that's really a barrier between me and the other person, in terms of just energetic barrier with the mood and the chemical. So I'd recommend no. I think once we identify as a meth addict, and this is my opinion, and the opinion of a lot of other people too, I think we really have to take a look at any mood altering chemical and be really clear and clean about not using them, because it's just so easy. We've talked about whack-a-moles here. You know, we give up one thing, another thing pops up, and it's just so easy to transfer those addictions. So I'd be really cautious.
After heavy meth use, meth addiction, you know, it damages the brain. The brain can heal, but it takes a while. And as part of recovery, you know, we need our brains to heal so we can normalize the pleasure center in our brain. And the analogy that I use, and it's not a very good analogy because it's not accurate. It's not a bruise on our brain, but if you picture a bruise on your brain, and meth is a sledgehammer pounding on that bruise, and marijuana just might be a slap, but it's still pounding on the bruise and keeping it from healing. And you know, nicotine is the same way. It's still pounding on that part and preventing the brain from healing. And when the brain can't heal, you know, we're going to constantly be struggling with our addiction. When the brain heals, the addiction has much less power and much less hold over us. So.
You're probably not going to like this either, but we had a conversation at my In the Rooms last night about poppers, and how in the gay community, a lot of guys kind of use poppers even though they're in recovery. And it's kind of like I don't know if it's a free pass or what, but poppers are a very intense drug and a very distinct mood altering sensation that I think is highly addictive. And I really think it's a mistake to use poppers as well, although a lot of guys give themselves a pass on that. But I think we really have to be just really clean about what we do. And otherwise, we're kind of slowing ourselves down.
I agree. As a porn addict in recovery, can you regain intimate connection with your wife? Excellent question.
Yeah, great question. So, you know, porn addiction, like sex addiction, is really could be considered an intimacy disorder, right? And you're talking about regaining intimate connection with your wife. Pornography. What does pornography do? It really, we've talked about fantasy tonight. It drops you right into that fantasy channel, and you're often running and dealing with, you know, hundreds if not thousands of images, and it's a whole different dynamic. It's a whole different way of relating to your sex object, right? It's an image. You have total control. There's no vulnerability. There's no trust issues. It's safe. You can turn it off if you want. You can go to the next one. You're in your fantasy. You're totally controlling what's happening. When we get engaged with a human being, it's very different because they have feelings, they have thoughts, they have reactions. They may not be in our total control, and so it's a very different experience. And so I think it's a major challenge, I think, for a porn addict to move into an intimate connection with a person. It happens all the time. People do it, but I think it's one that really requires some work and some dedication to that process, because it's a whole different way of relating. And it's kind of giving up that fantasy we've been talking about, and allowing yourself to be uncomfortable, and to be uncomfortable with intimacy, to be engaging with a living person who has needs and wants and feelings, and can give and receive pleasure, and there's a lot less control. So I think it's a whole different set of issues. I would encourage you and your wife to get some kind of couples therapy or couples counseling if you're not already, because that can really, really help. There's really great communication skills that can be done. There's Masters and Johnson did a couples protocol, sensual communication protocol called Sensate Focus, which is really helpful to regain that intimate connection. So there's a lot of ways to do it, but I think it's a challenge, because it's almost the opposite of porn is almost the opposite of connection with a human being. And so it's something to really work at, but it happens all the time. Of course it can be done, but it's something that takes some effort.
Yeah, and as David said earlier, and I think we pretty much say every week, you know, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And the whole goal of recovery is to get us out of this disconnected state and into a connected state. Now, the interesting thing about not just sex and porn addicts, but any addict, is we often find it easier to connect early on in our recovery with others who are in recovery and with our sponsor and with our therapist. And usually the spouse is sort of the last one to get the benefit of our ability to reconnect. And that's because that's the hardest, that's the person that we're most afraid of being hurt by. And addiction is a fear of being hurt. So instead of turning to people who might meet our needs, we turn to a substance or behavior that can't hurt us, like porn. Although porn can hurt us, but not by rejecting us. As David said, we control the situation. It's a pure fantasy. It's not real. There's no risk of rejection or embarrassment or any of that stuff because there's nobody there.
I wanted to add, there's another factor in here, of course, besides you. It's your wife. And the partner of a porn addict, just like the partner of a sex addict, has gone through a whole lot, including a lot of traumatic stuff that may be hard sometimes for a porn. I've heard a lot of guys say, well, it's just porn. Well, the partners of a porn addict go through a lot of trauma and reactivity to it. So I think it also takes a willing partner on your wife's part in terms of regaining that trust and developing that. And really that's where those effective communication skills really do come in and benefit, because it takes two. And both sides of that equation need to be really worked on and given the benefit of time to heal.
Yeah, it will take time, but it really can happen. And it just starts with little baby steps of communication and developing empathy for what you the pain you've caused, and to your wife and to yourself. You need to have empathy for yourself too. So 2 years from discovery of my husband's porn addiction and emotional affair, a few weeks ago, he came to terms with the fact that his mother's sudden death when he was 16 left him angry and he never dealt with it. Can you tell me where to go from here? He is making amends to his father and siblings, which I'm very proud of. But if I try to talk to him, he says he doesn't want to talk about his past because he's let it go.
Okay, so, this is not unusual in recovery where I mentioned early, trauma really underlies a lot of addiction. And so part of a healthy recovery process, I think, is really dealing with some of that early trauma and coming to terms with it. And that takes specialized trauma therapy, and there's many different modalities for that. And 2 years is probably about a good time to deal with some of that. I would say this is your husband's journey, I think, and some of this trauma work. Communication is going to be important. I think he may need to find his own way in terms of sharing with you. I am a little concerned that he would say he let it go, because I think trauma is one of those things that is kind of a process and it takes maybe longer than he's been engaged in that process to really work through some of those feelings. So there may be a little bit of a shutdown or a wall there of communication. So the fact that he's making amends and working on it is really great. I think, I'm not sure what you can do except to be steady and be a willing ear and a good listener for that. Again, a couples counselor might help guide you in terms of what he might need from you in that process. But the kind of loss he's describing is important. I can't really give you specifics of where to go, except maybe how to react to his work here, and make sure you're getting care for yourself and support for you too, if you need it in this process. Because we know from what I just said too, partners really need a lot of support in this, just for the experience that they've gone through. But depending on where your husband is at, he may need different things, just encouragement or a little push or just silent being there or a good listener. I'm not sure what, but I think a counselor could guide you guys both, just being, seeing you and what your needs are and how you interact. But I will say, the kind of work he's doing sounds pretty heavy duty stuff that, whenever we deal with trauma, it's major kind of life event stuff that really has shaped our lives. And so in a way, he's unwinding a lot of that that's really had a major impact on him. And so I would expect his reactions to be a little different and Maybe you might be a little needier or a little less needy, I'm not sure. But I think just consistency on your part and support, non-judgmental support, and making sure you're getting the care for you is probably the best you can do in that, I would think. Scott,
I keep muting myself because I'm in chewing ice. I wanted to point out that I love the way this question is worded. It's very pro-dependent as opposed to the old shaming, blaming, taking it on yourself codependency language. I wonder if you've been sitting in on some of our pro-dependence webinars. I'm betting you have, because you're not taking this on as your problem. You're asking how you can support him as effectively as possible because you love and care about him and you're proud of the work that he's doing, but it's not your problem to fix, and you know that. And you know, I mean, that's the way the question is worded. That's what I'm making up in my head, and I'm really excited about that. And I want to tell you that I'm proud of you. And I really like it. And yeah, I mean, you know, he's got to go through his own process. I have done trauma work in my own life, and you know, I think I've got it under control and everything's done. And then a few years later or a few months later, it pops up again, and there are more layers to peel back. And each layer of the onion is stickier and makes me try harder than the last one. And that's trauma work. But somehow the trauma is not, it doesn't drive my decision making the way that it used to. You know, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder when I got into recovery, and it was a very accurate diagnosis. And it still crops up once in a while, but not like it used to. And I know what it is, and I know why it is, and you know, and I know that I need to do some more work. So I go back and I do some more work and cry a little bit, and then I think I've let it go. And you know, a few months or a few years later, I find out, no, not quite. And David, that's pretty normal for trauma work, isn't it? It's sort of layers.
yeah, that's been my own experience too. And I think we tend to judge it or judge ourselves. You know, I thought, gee, I thought I dealt with that, you know, already. And then here it is again, but it's always a different perspective. It's always a little bit more insight, a little deeper phenomenon, but it still hurts like heck. But it's really meaningful. And I think, yeah, it doesn't have the power and the control I think it did, or my reactions, because I have more insight on it. But I sure do still stumble across layers of old stuff that I thought was let go long ago. So yeah, for sure. For sure. I also was just reading that question again. He just, a few weeks ago, he came to terms with a traumatic events. This is all, I mean, this process, it's very fresh when those things are kind of re-engaged. So yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah, and you know, you can be really supportive to him by just saying, I'm here to listen if and when you want to talk. You know, I love you. I'm here for you if and when you need me and are ready. I think that's it. And eventually he will be ready, but maybe not today. Yeah. Okay. This is from, I have felt broken many times after a sex binge, and now I have a meth addiction as well. I think the healthiest, safest option is a loving, caring, monogamous relationship. However, I have trouble believing that I can enjoy a monogamous relationship after sleeping with so many people and being addicted to new experiences. Thoughts?
Yeah, so I think this phenomenon is typical of gay men, straight men, gay women, straight women, any sex addict that has a lot of partners, really, I think, looking to kind of fill that hole and feel connected. And the irony is that it just usually ends up making them feel more disconnected and less and kind of hollow in a sense. And so I think it's natural. I think it's natural to be have some concern about the possibility that it could happen to you. I think I would just this might be a really good thing to put out in a meeting if you have a nice, strong meeting to talk about this, because the experience, I think the lived experience of people is that if they want a relationship like that, or whatever kind of relationship they want, whether it's monogamous or not, or to be involved with someone in any kind of intimate level at all, it's absolutely possible. I think it's just our past, in that sense, doesn't limit or necessarily define what it looks like in the future. I think the big X factor in that equation would be you and your intention and your desire. Once you do some healing and get in touch with feelings, and remember we've been talking about addiction as a way to numb emotional pain and avoid and deal with old abandonment and all those issues. And when we talk about a relationship, especially an intimate one and especially a monogamous one, you know, all those issues come up. And I think we need to really kind of make peace with our history with some of that stuff before those relationships become viable or possible. But I think absolutely, again, that happens every day as well. You know, people, if they choose and work at it, have beautiful, sustained relationships. And I think that's totally possible. But I think it's a matter of doing the work. I think it's what, you know, we talk about intimacy disorders, and I think for a lot of addicts, it comes down to being vulnerable, being able to trust, being able to be worthy, feeling you're worthy of love. You know, all these issues that are really deep, important questions, I think need to be kind of explored and addressed. And again, if you're not in therapy, you might really benefit from being in therapy, or just having a guide who can go through some of these issues with you. I think, could you do this on your own? Yes, but I think you're going to save a lot of time if you have somebody to kind of help you discover these points and work through them. And there may very well be, as we've talked about tonight, and some other questions, some trauma there that needs to be addressed that can help you also, because a lot of times with the best of intentions, we trip ourselves up with old reactions that seem to come out of the blue or over which we have no control. And really those are kind of traumatic reactions that we need to get some handle on. So I wouldn't be discouraged. I would know what you want. You know, part of the recovery and a lot of recovery groups is really setting intention and to really figure out what is it that you want? You know, what kind of relationship with who, and go for it. And it can be yours, absolutely. It's going to take some work and willingness on your part.
Yeah, there needs to be an understanding on your part that, you know, a lasting relationship is not based on intensity. You know, especially a lasting, intimately connected relationship. It starts with some intensity, sure, but it builds into something else. You know, the intimate connection becomes more valuable than the intensity. It becomes more valuable than the intensity. It doesn't start out that way. You have to build that with somebody. You have to learn that you know, the joys, the little joys of a relationship, you know, outweigh that, you know, intense limerence stage of a relationship eventually. So.
And you also say you have a meth addiction. I don't know if you're in recovery or not, but I mean, that's clearly that's going to interfere with any possibility of your having a healthy relationship in the long run, I think. And so, you know, you're seeing clients who had a meth addiction, who kept kind of relapsing and got stuck in the meth addiction, and they had the fantasy of wanting intimate, monogamous, healthy relationship, but their addiction kept getting in the way. And so really an essential first step in this is to get into recovery if you're not already. I assumed you were when I first read it, but I'm not sure there. But you know, obviously dealing with the meth issue and getting some recovery under your belt from that is going to be an essential first step to make these other moves we've been discussing.
Yeah, and by the way, relationships are not a necessity for sobriety or recovery. You know, I'm long sober. I am not in a relationship, and I'm perfectly okay with it. I have a lot of intimate support with friends and family. I get my needs met that way, rather than having somebody, you know, live in my house with me. And you know, some people aren't. You know, I'm just not a relationship person. I never was. Even before I was an addict, I didn't fantasize about, you know, the partner and the white picket fence and the 2 kids and the dog. And you know, I just didn't. It wasn't what I wanted from life. And I don't know what you really want from life. And I think you're going to have to be sober for a while before you really have a clue about who you are and what makes you tick. And it may not be a relationship, but it may be. You don't know. So yeah, I wouldn't try to force myself. You know, right now you're a square peg trying to force yourself into a round hole, and you know, just pull away and you know, figure out what shape peg you really are, and then you know, find something that fits for you in your life and your recovery that's going to make you happy and content and satisfied, and you know, all those things that we all really truly want, even if we're an intensity addict. So, okay, next question. I've done porn, which means I've been in porn. How do I approach this when meeting people? Some people recognize me, friends may have seen it, tell potential dating partners who may want to see it. I'd prefer to leave it in the rearview mirror. I also don't want the porn to set unrealistic expectations or recreate a fantasy or create a fantasy of who I am, et cetera, et cetera. So specifically about porn, but also about, you know, anything in our past that we're not too keen on. How do we reveal that to somebody when do we reveal that? How do we reveal that? And to whom do we reveal that? You know, in our relationships, romantic or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big issue. We remember oftentimes we as addicts have different issues with trust and vulnerability and safety. And so I think we really have to really evaluate that and keep that as a priority. I think one of the mistakes people make is feeling anxious about revealing something and they blurt it out or tell too many people as a way to deal with their own anxiety in the moment. And then they regret having told so many people. I would be very judicious about it. I think you have to really follow your gut in this and what your comfort level is. If there's someone that's important to you that you feel you want to talk about this with, and certainly I think personally, if you're going to be getting involved with someone in an intimate way, this is obviously going to have to come up. But I don't think you owe an explanation to anybody unless it's your choice. And I'm sure the discomfort of being recognized. I'm not sure honestly what to say about that. But I think in terms of what you do, how you react, you don't have to let that control you. I think I would just take control of it in terms of your messaging and what you want to reveal to people and when. This is an age-old issue, whether it's an HIV status or a history in porn or something else. You know, anything like this is important to talk about at some point. And I think there's no rule book, unfortunately, on the exact timing or sequence of these things as you're developing a relationship, except you want to take your feelings into account and the feelings of the other person. I think it's the longer you go, if there's something major, then it becomes an issue, of course. And why didn't you tell me this before? And so it's a matter of timing and trust. And again, I think we have to go with kind of your intuition on this because there's no good rule book. But I think the most important thing in this is to take care of you and yourself and your feelings and not let other people's opinion or gossip or whatever control you or how you feel about yourself. You know, I don't know where you're at. You don't mention this, and I'm glad, but you know, often there's a lot of shame about some of these things, right? And shame is not our friend if we're an addict. And I think so it's really important to kind of manage that and be aware of that and make sure that you're okay with you and what you've done in the past and however that needs to take shape.
Yeah, and you know, I'll use myself as an example here. There's about 8 or 9 people in my life who know everything, but they're people who've earned it, and you know, I kind of sat them down individually at some point along the way, mostly all at once. I just decided, you know what, if these people are going to be my friends, they need to know everything. And I felt comfortable that they weren't going to reject me or judge me too harshly, or you know. And so now they know everything, and most of them revealed their dark, ugly secrets to me in the process, and we had real bonding moments. I have a second layer of friends, probably another 8 or 9 people, who don't know everything. They know a lot, but they don't know everything. And mostly it's because I just don't feel close enough to them. But in a couple of instances, it's because I've heard them say things, and I know that they may not take it very well if I tell them everything. So, you know, that's the way it is. I don't feel safe telling them everything, so I don't. And in a romantic setting, if you're dating somebody, you know, when you feel safe enough, then I think you have to come clean, but not until you feel safe enough. The person has to earn it.
Right. Totally.
You know, people earn the right to know our secrets. So anyway, that's my thought. And I have a sponsee who, and that's exactly what I told a sponsee of mine a few years ago who had done porn. I was like, you know, they have to earn it. But then you have to tell them at some point, you know, if you're going to get serious. That's it. We are out of time, everybody. Thank you for being here. David, thank you for picking fantasy as a topic. What a great topic, especially with sex and porn addiction and chemsex addiction. It's just such an integral part of the cycle. It is the high.
Exactly. Yeah.
Anything you want to take us out with?
No, I think it's just great conversation, great questions. I appreciate everybody being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all. We'll see you next week. David will be back. I'll be back, and we'll see you then.
Okay. Thanks. Good night, everybody.
Good night all.